Okay, so it is 7:01 now, or for some of us in different time zones, maybe not 7:01, but I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here for this really, really important event so that we can discuss anti-Semitism and also how to combat it on our campus and in any of the circles that we run in. So this event is going to have a panel of students as well as someone from the ADL to go ahead and help us lead this, and Dr. Avi Pat. So I'm going to go ahead and read some quick bios for the people joining us on this call today, so that you know who everyone is when they're speaking. So I'll go ahead and start with myself. I'm Dory Jacobs, and I'm a junior psychology and applied mathematics double major. I'm about to start my second term as president of the UConn Hillel Student Board, and I also serve on the board of the Club Huskies for Israel, as well as have a position as an undergraduate research assistant in a psychology lab on campus. And immediately after hearing about the anti-Semitic incidents in South Campus, I began collaborating with the rest of the UConn Hillel board in our response to these incidents. So now I'll go ahead and introduce the rest of our panel. So we have Dr. Pat, who is the Doris and Simon Conover Chair of Judaic Studies and Director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut. He is the author and editor of multiple books on Jewish life and culture before, during, and after the Holocaust. Professor Pat teaches courses that cover a broad range of topics in modern Jewish history, including modern Jewish thought, Jewish humor, American Jewish literature, the history of Israel and Zionism, American Jewish history, and Jewish responses to the Holocaust. We also have Margie Lipschitz Shapiro, who is the Deputy Director of the Connecticut Office of the Anti-Defamation League. She has trained thousands of students and educators on topics including fighting anti-Semitism and racism, and works to develop effective responses to hate and bias incidents for colleges, schools, and communities. Margie created and helped coordinate tonight's program. We have Nathan Schachter, who is a 2019 graduate of UConn and originally from West Hartford, Connecticut. He recently moved to Israel and is currently a donor relations manager at the Jewish Agency for Israel, with a rich history of Jewish communal work. In August 2017, he was a victim of an anti-Semitic attack here on campus. We have Somya Potu, who is a current senior computer science major here at UConn. She serves as an RA in South Campus, a student leader in community outreach, and as captain of her dance team, UConn Surya. Somya is an RA in the area where this semester's anti-Semitic incidents at UConn took place, and got involved with UConn Hillel through meetings in response to these incidents. These meetings have helped her see the importance of being an upstander, and she is excited to be on this panel today as an ally in the fight against anti-Semitism. We then have Matan Daron, who is a junior biology and individualized double major. He currently serves as a student board member for Hillel, the global health spaces on campus, and the UConn men's crew team. Additionally, he was responsible for writing an op-ed published in the Daily Campus, which addressed UConn's response to anti-Semitic incidents that took place on campus. So I will go ahead and give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to do tonight. So unfortunately, we're here tonight because of an uptick in anti-Semitic incidents at UConn, but I believe that this event is a testament to the passionate and hardworking Jewish leaders on our campus, as well as the wonderful allies to the Jewish community who have graciously stepped up to fight prejudice. You may have heard about the 3 anti-Semitic incidents that occurred in South Campus residence halls, ranging from anti-Semitic words written on a whiteboard to swastika graffiti. These incidents made Jewish students feel vulnerable, unsafe, and brought back feelings of generational trauma. These incidents are part of a worldwide spike in anti-Semitism, but it is events like this one in which you come to listen, learn, and understand that can prevent further incidents of hate. We'll start off with Dr. Pat giving some brief background on anti-Semitism, and we'll then move to our student panelists who will share their experiences with anti-Semitism, as well as their insight on how to combat it. Finally, we will move to a Q&A and discussion moderated by Margie that will allow you to all ask questions and share your insights as well. I just ask that you remain on mute while our panelists are speaking, and you can leave any questions you have throughout in the chat at any point, or you can hold them for our Q&A section. So before we begin, I'd love it if you guys could share a reason that you're here tonight in the chat, because it's all of you guys coming here and all of showing that you care that really means so much. So I'd love if you could share that in the chat. And then we will go ahead and move over to Dr. Pat, who will give us our background on anti-Semitism. I love the answers in the chat. So I'm here to have meaningful discussions about how we can combat anti-Semitism, to be an ally, to support our campus community, to be a better ally, which are all really, really great reasons. And I'm so glad that you guys came here to do that. So with that, I will hand it on over to Dr. Pat.
All right, thank you so much, Dory, for your leadership, both in organizing this program and your leadership in helping our campus community respond to the recent incidents of anti-Semitism. I just want to applaud the Hillel, UConn Hillel, the Hillel board, the student leadership, the e-board for really bringing awareness and demonstrating the strong leadership skills that you bring to our community. So thank you so much for taking the lead in all of this. And I appreciate the invitation to speak this evening. I've been asked to do a 5 to 7 minute overview of the history of anti-Semitism. So I'm going to try to do my best to set the scene a little bit about sort of the meaning of anti-Semitism, the definition of anti-Semitism, why it's so important for us to respond in the ways that we already have as a campus community, and hopefully set the stage for a meaningful discussion that will take place afterwards, both in terms of our students sharing their experiences, and Margie from the Anti-Defamation League talking about what are some of the best ways to respond to anti-Semitism. So I'm going to share my screen, and let me go up here so you can see. And one of the components that yeah, hopefully you can see my screen here about anti-Semitism in America today. And one of the things that I wanted us to talk about and focus on in my discussion is to provide some context about the moment in which we're living in, which, as Dory alluded to, we're seeing an unprecedented spike in anti-Semitism, not only in the United States, but around the world, which is accompanying sort of what we can see as alarming levels of racism, xenophobia, discrimination of all forms. And so I want to situate this within both that broader context, but also for us to think specifically about how the Jewish community, both on campus, in our state, and around our country, can effectively respond to the types of anti-Semitism that we are seeing today. So first of all, this anti-Semitism that we are seeing is distinctive in terms of our present moment. I want to say right off the bat that it's always distinctive. That is that anti-Semitism is on one hand, an ancient form of hatred that is directed against Jews, Judaism, the Jewish people, but that often takes on many forms and is malleable and can change shape and be used for multiple political ideologies as a form of discrimination. Jewish history, of course, has a long history of persecution. What I can showing you here is a poster that was created by survivors of the Holocaust in the DP camps of post-war Germany to encourage their fellow Jews to share their testimonies in the aftermath of the Holocaust, to make sure that what they had experienced would not be forgotten. Across the top, it says, "Remember what Amalek has done to you, Zachor et asher asalecha Amalek." But the survivors also situated their experiences in the aftermath of the Holocaust in a long series of attacks and persecutions that the Jewish people had endured, with an implicit statement from going from the time of slavery in Egypt to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, to the expulsion from
Avi, I don't think we can hear you right now.
I might be having some Wi-Fi issues. Am I back?
Yes, yes.
Sorry. Okay. My Wi-Fi. Anyway, I think you probably see this poster in front of you. This is just to say that there's a long history of persecution, but also to point out that most of Jewish history is not a history of persecution. That is that while there is a tendency to focus in collective memory on these periods of persecution and violence, the periods in between usually constitute long periods of successful living in the various communities in which Jews have lived. So there is that joke that is often told about Jewish history and Jewish holidays, which tend to focus on what are Jewish holidays. It's an idea that they tried to kill us, we won, let's eat, right? And there is a way to reduce Jewish history to that, but also it's important for us to understand that while we have these upticks and these surges in persecution, usually we have long periods of sort of peaceful coexistence in between, and humor is something that can be an important response in those times. That being said, I do want to provide a little bit of background on the history of anti-Semitism that we're dealing with here in the modern period. And I'll just say that this term anti-Semitism is invented by an anti-Semite. So even when we use the term anti-Semitism, and you'll see that sometimes you see it with a hyphen, anti-Semitism. I like to use it with no hyphen because there's really nothing that is actually a Semite to be opposed to, except for people who try to define their identity, like Wilhelm Marr in the 1870s, who was worried about German identity being taken over by sort of a Jews given citizenship, who proudly identified himself as an anti-Semite. Wilhelm Marr was an anti-Semite who coined this term anti-Semitism. And this is a period of time where we start to see anti-Semitism being fused with new national identities, but also a type of anti-Semitism that combines with a form of racism that is emerging in 19th century Europe that argues that there are essential characteristics to different racial groups that can never be changed. That argues also for the superiority of, in the case of Houston Stewart Chamberlain, the idea that the white Aryan Europeans were superior to other groups around the world, including Jews in particular in Europe, and that there were certain essential characteristics that could be identified with each group. And in the 19th century, we begin to see this form of a distinctive type of racism and racial anti-Semitism that changes the nature of what had been a historic anti-Judaism that was in the form of religious competition and often a Christian anti-Judaism that turns into a secularized form of anti-Semitism that is wedded to racism. I have a lot here, but in the interest of time, I'll gloss over most of it. What we begin to see in the beginning of the 1900s is the spread of conspiracy theories like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion that argue that there is a global conspiracy led by the Jews to dominate different groups all over the world. And even though this has
I think you might be cutting out again.
You had us on a cliffhanger there, Avi.
Dory, have I frozen again?
Yes, you're back now.
All right, it's a sign. I think this might be some sort of global conspiracy against my internet, just by the way. So I apologize. So I'm gonna skip ahead in the interest of time, and I'll just I just want to point out that there's a long history of anti-Semitism in America also, that this moment that we're living in is not new. The timing of, in the beginning of the 1900s, we see this taking place, for example, with the lynching of Leo Frank, Henry Ford, and his publication of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in the form of the International Jew and the Dearborn Independent, and also in the context of the Second World War, as we see the rise of Nazism, an American response, which all too often sort of says it's too bad what's happening to the Jews in Europe, but it's not the problem of the United States. We shouldn't really get involved. Since I don't know how long my Wi-Fi is going to hold out, Dory, I'm going to skip ahead over the history of anti-Semitism in America. and just say that in the present moment that we're living in, there are many forms of contemporary anti-Semitism that both takes the form of right-wing nationalism, Holocaust denial, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism of the left, and enduring conspiracy theories on right and left. Was I freezing again, Dory? Sorry.
We could still hear you though, so
Okay.
all good.
Okay, I apologize. So all of these different forms of anti-Semitism, that is the anti-Semitism of the right and the anti-Semitism of the left, which we can discuss in the program, has seemed to be on the upsurge in the recent years. And so, of course, here you can see this image from 2017 in Charlottesville, the Unite the Right rally, where we had groups of the alt-right, white nationalists coming together in Charlottesville, Virginia, warning or fearing the taking over of sort of a white supremacy in America that was organized, they thought, by Jews. So you have this group sort of marching through the streets saying Jews will not replace us, and a campaign, a conspiracy organized by Jews to dilute the white majority America with other racial groups and immigrants. And this is what we're seeing in our present moment that is so concerning for Jews in the United States. What had seemed to be on the fringes of sort of American political life, that of course has now come to the center of American political life, and has been accompanied by this concerning uptick in anti-Semitism. In 2018, the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, where again you had somebody who was convinced that Jews were behind a conspiracy to bring immigrants into America and dilute sort of the white nationalist character of America. We see 11 Jews being shot at the Tree of Life synagogue shooting in October of 2018. In the most recent political moment, people protesting against government-mandated lockdowns or mask wearing, invoking Nazi imagery, right? So some conflation of big government with Nazi imagery. QAnon, which plays upon, again, age-old anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and protocols of the Elders of Zion, and even anti-Zionism and attacks on the state of Israel, which are often accompanied by contemporary forms of Holocaust denial, or trivializing the Holocaust, or alleging that the Holocaust was invented by the Jewish people to justify the creation of the state of Israel. We can discuss this as part of our program. It's very important for us to understand that the point in which legitimate criticism of Israel becomes anti-Semitism is the point where it turns into the denial of the right of Israel to exist, or conflating Jewishness with all Jews being held responsible for the actions of Israel. And this most recent year, what we saw in terms of anti-Semitic attacks and harassment taking place on our campus is also part of a broader trend that we're seeing on college campuses across the United States. So many of you might remember the burning of the University of Delaware Chabad Center in August of this year. Hillel International has reported that this year anti-Semitic incidents reached an all-time high on American college campuses. So again, this is part of a broader trend that we're seeing. The ADL's sort of heat map that is demonstrating places where anti-Semitism has taken place. It's an excellent resource, which Margie can talk about. We're seeing an alarming uptick across the country. And indeed, the American Jewish Committee did a survey this year where American Jews are very concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism. 88% of American Jews think that anti-Semitism is a problem in the United States today, compared to a somewhat smaller percentage, 62% of the general public. And again, 82% of American Jews think that anti-Semitism has increased in the last 5 years, accompanied by 43%. So we can talk about that perception gap as well. I know I've gone on and I've had internet issues, so I'm going to leave it there. But I think we can see that there's a lot for us to think about in terms of our present moment what we're dealing with on our campus, being part of a larger concerning uptick that's taking place, across the country. And there's reason for our students to feel very concerned and very vulnerable. We're part of this larger phenomenon that's going on, and we have to think about how to address it effectively, both on campus, in our state, and around the country. I apologize for my internet issues. I hope some of that came through, and I'm going to turn it back over to Dory, who's going to introduce our student panelists who are going to share some of their experiences now. Dory, I turn it back over to you. Thank you.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started with our panelists who are going to talk about their experience with anti-Semitism and give some of their insights on how we can fight anti-Semitism. I'm going to go ahead and start, and then we'll go on to the other three panelists. So I'll start with a little background about me and the ways in which I have experienced anti-Semitism throughout my life. So I'm from a suburb in Southern California, not from Connecticut, and I was never surrounded by a lot of Jews growing up. I went to a high school of 2,500 students, but it seemed like my Jewish identity was completely separate from my identity at school. My friends would often make anti-Semitic remarks towards me, but I knew that they cared about me, so I just let them get away with it, and I let what they considered to be jokes stay jokes, so that I didn't seem too sensitive or as though I was playing the victim. So I excused it when people told me that I was a good Jew for picking up a quarter off the ground, or when a friend wrote Jew across my math homework every morning, and I would try to erase it, but I could never quite get it off before I turned it in. I excused these behaviors because I thought that they were normal. I thought that the way that they made me feel was what was abnormal, and that it was my fault for not being able to take these jokes. One time, when a boy texted "Hail Hitler" in our AP European class group message while we were watching Schindler's List, I had finally had enough. So I replied in the group message saying that comments praising Hitler, even if it's meant as a joke, are never okay. Of all of my friends who claimed to love and support me, it was only one who backed me up when I received backlash for that message. So I went back to ignoring those so-called jokes. And then when I came to UConn, I finally was part of a much larger Jewish community. And then I got involved with UConn Hillel, and it felt like my two separate identities that I had always kept very, very separate finally merged into one complete identity that was fully my identity. And then I finally realized that I deserved to be able to stand up for myself and for other Jews, and that I'm not sensitive for asking for basic respect in the way that people treat me. So when these anti-Semitic incidents occurred in South Campus, at first I wanted to hide and separate from my Jewishness again. But then I remembered that I'm proud of my Judaism, and I used these incidents to empower me to dive into work fighting anti-Semitism of all forms and fighting anti-Semitism and hate of all forms on our campus and beyond our campus. So what I want you to take away from this story is that when someone comes to you and says that something you said, whether you perceive it as a joke or perceive it as small, is offensive or prejudiced in any way to their identity, whether their identity is Judaism or not, to believe them and respect them, and also to acknowledge their bravery in coming to you with that. It can be really, really scary to go to someone, especially someone you care about, and worry that they will not want to be your friend anymore, will not want to associate with you anymore, because you are calling them out for their problematic actions. So always remember the bravery of people speaking up to you, and also believe and respect them when they say that something is prejudice and shouldn't be acceptable. All right, so first of all, I'd like to say, remember that you can send questions in the chat at any point if you'd like, or you can save them for our Q&A. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Matan so that he can speak on his story.
So thank you, Dory, for telling us a story. My story isn't so dissimilar from Dory's. I grew up going to a Jewish day school up until 8th grade. And when I entered high school, I entered public high school, and it was kind of a fish out of water, it felt. And I remember the first day of my sophomore year in high school, when my friend, who I thought was my friend, approached me and and goes, "Oh, you're back from the concentration camps." And I was a little taken aback, to say the least. But in a similar way to Dory's experiences, the anti-Semitism that I confronted was very much in the form of jokes. One of my favorite ones, for lack of a better term, was, "What's the difference between Jews and Santa Claus?" Some of you guys may know the answer. Jews go up the chimney and Santa comes down the chimney, right? And so a lot of the times, when confronted with anti-Semitism, like Dory said, the instinct is to just laugh along, to play it cool, not to upset it. And even, I've had a friend who showed me a picture from a party he went to, and, they were playing Pong, and there was a neatly arranged swastika and solo cups on the table. And I was, I questioned him. I said, "And you did what about this?" And he goes, "I don't know, I thought it was a joke." And so, again, I mean, these symbols, there's an ignorance that's, allowed to seep onto the surface, and that, some of these jokes are okay, and not understanding the history behind these symbols. And occasionally, taking on the mantle of, whether it's educating people or whether it's telling your own story, can be difficult at times. And so I encourage, people who are here today is to make room for people, of any faith, any creed, any color. Make room for them to tell their stories in a way that they feel heard, but also in a way that, that you support them, that you make it very clear that you are at their side as well. And so with that, I'd like to pass it on to the next person to speak.
Yeah, we're going to go ahead and give it to Nathan, who graduated from UConn in 2019.
So first, I want to say shalom to everyone from Jerusalem. I'm really, really honored to be on the call tonight with everyone and see such a great turnout. Just to give a little framing to my story, I grew up in West Hartford, Connecticut, a suburb in Connecticut, but also a very strong Jewish community. And like Matan, I grew up going to Jewish day school my whole life. So UConn was really the first time that I was outside of a Jewish bubble, and the first time that I was with people who were different than me, per se. When I got to UConn as a religious Jew, I wear kippah all the time. And so my cousin had made me a UConn kippah with a note that she gave me saying, "This is your first time stepping out of your bubble. And with this kippah, I want you to be an or legoim," which in Hebrew means a light unto the nations. And so for my first 2 years of UConn, I didn't experience anything. I actually got more positive responses, people asking where I got my kippah, if they could have one as well. And it was a joke within my family that my cousin would now start a business. And I'll give you the framing as well that you may remember towards the end of the summer of 2017, there was the incident in Charlottesville. And right upon return to campus, there was a vigil held, which Hillel took part in as well, where we all came together as one campus community on the first night of school to kind of take a stance against discrimination. A few days later, on Thursday of that week, I was walking up to the dining hall and a car passed me, and the girl yelled out a window, and excuse me for the expletive, "Go to the fucking ovens." Now this took me by shock because for 2 years, I had experienced nothing on the UConn campus. And also in my life, I had experienced nothing. But suddenly in one moment, what one girl said to me had shaken my entire world. And what felt like home on campus suddenly had crumbled. That night, a friend came over to my dorm room and I let it out. We talked through what was gonna happen. And I have to say from one side, the Dean of Students Office, Res Life, was very supportive. On the other hand, something that I took upon myself as well, just because I am a writer and I like to share my thoughts, I ended up posting on my Facebook what had happened, just to let people know. I expected maybe 100, 200 of my friends would comment, like, or whatnot. And in the end, and I have it here still as well, the kippah, I attached a picture. And within the day, The post garnered over 1.4 thousand likes, over 300 shares, and hundreds of comments. And I felt like I had gotten my 15 minutes of fame, but it was overwhelming for a second. And from this post, I didn't know what to do next. And I'll be completely honest, what I want to share to everyone here on the call of what step you can take was not more than I did after that post, it's what the campus community did. The next day in the Daily Campus, there was an op-ed from the editorial staff with the title, "We as a campus community need to take a stand against discrimination." People would come from classes and they told me that instead of learning in class the day about business, economics, or whatever, their professor pulled up the Facebook post and had a discussion with their students about the role of discrimination and anti-Semitism on campus. And so I now look back and it said that I hope that no other students have to experience what I experienced. And it's a little disheartening to know that there's been more of a rise this year as well on campus. And I truly hope that, the campus can continue taking a stance against any form of discrimination, especially anti-Semitism right now as we're speaking. But I really want to empower all of you to also be an Or Goyim, a light unto the nations, and where you feel you can take a stance, whether it be as an upstander, someone supporting, or whether you yourself have experienced anything and feel that you can, you can take a stand as well and feel empowered to share your story. So with that, I will pass it on to Somya.
Yeah, we're going to go next to Somya, who's speaking as not a Jewish student, but an ally to us on our campus.
Yep. I want to shout out to all of your stories. That could not have been easy, and I thank you guys for sharing your stories so far. So first off, I want to thank the rest of the panel members and the organizers for inviting me to be here. As an ally, I truly believe that fighting against hate requires us to come together as allies and look past our differences. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I also want to give a shout out to our fellow allies that came out. It just goes to show the amazing students that we have at UConn. I think in a virtual and digital age, it's especially easy to filter out or to not see positivity and only focus on negative events like the anti-Semitic events that we've seen so far. But events like these really highlight the positive, amazing students that we have here and faculty, of course. So thank you all for coming. So like Dory said, I met the fellow panelists and organizers here in response to the first few anti-Semitic incidents in South Campus. And I really only went to those first couple of meetings as a representative of Rest Life and to show that there are students on campus to support you guys. I think I can speak for a good portion of the student population in that I didn't realize the prevalence of anti-Semitic hate crimes on college campuses, and I definitely didn't realize the deep impact that they have on Jewish students here at campus. So I went to that first meeting, and I was actually in a breakout room with Matan where he talked about his own experience in response to these anti-Semitic events. And for me, it really took listening to what Matan had to say to learn how these incidents impacted him and for me to become an upstander. Listening to someone speak about their personal experiences made me sit with myself and take the time to understand how historical symbols can deeply hurt someone in terms of their identity, in terms of their culture, in terms of their whole life. And that's when it really made me sit and hit me as an ally that I play an active role in the fight against anti-Semitism. It was a true turning point for me. And I remember thinking, I don't mean to speak for anyone here, but I just remember thinking that if that was me and if I was in your shoes, I would want to know that there were students and faculty standing with me. So I forced myself to start putting in the work and to become an upstander. I really truly believe that the burden of fighting against hate shouldn't fall on the victims of those hate crimes. Bystanders play a huge part, and if we want to be anti-racist and fight against anti-Semitism, we have to put in the work and become upstanders. I also want to mention that it's not something that's incredibly hard either. We have the internet at our fingertips to educate ourselves on anything and everything, to attend lectures, to have important conversations, to meet new people, to be part of panels. And it can be difficult to have those initial difficult conversations about race. I think everyone here has had those, and everyone who's here is here because they want to have those conversations. I'll be honest, once I started getting in those active in those conversations, I was kicking myself for not doing it sooner. So truly applaud everyone who's here and having those conversations. The last thing that I want to mention is something that I've been thinking recently about the idea of change and progress. There's no one-off event or solution that will solve any racial issues. We have to continuously put on the work to keep change and progress moving forward. So keep on listening to people's stories, making room for their stories, and being an active upstander, and that's when we'll actually see that progress. So yeah, I think the next part is questions and answers. So.
Yeah, thank you so much, Soumya. So I'm gonna go ahead and hand it over to Margie, who's gonna help lead us in our Q&A and discussion.
Thank you, Dory. I know you're all going to want to join me in applauding these very brave students who are willing to share pain and share expectations for all of us, and how to be an ally. So now, and I also, as one of the few people here who's not a Husky, although a Connecticut resident most of my life, I want to say to be a part of your community grappling and learning, and taking what are painful incidents and turning them into progress is pretty much what I live for. After 30 years at ADL, this is the best part of my job, because I have seen people, and Nathan, thank you, become a light and go from darkness into light, and I know that it's possible, and it's just a terrific opportunity. So now is the time. I don't see any actual questions in the chat, so you can unmute yourself. I ask that we start with a question, not your story, but a question for a panelist, for Avi, myself, Adina from Hillel. You have a question, that would be great. So let's start there. We have our first one. Thank you, Kelly. How can non-Jewish allies stand up in anti-Semitic situations? It's a great question. That's exactly what we're here for. So does, and I know students have shared some tips and some thoughts, but we'd love to hear more. So who has a thought on that from the panel first? And then if there's others in the audience who also want to share tips, that would be fine too. But let's start with the panelists.
Margie, I could go ahead and answer that question. As Professor Gordon, who's here tonight, likes to say, you know, conversation and interacting with people creates room for possibility. And so I think, you know, the most important step, you know, in anything is making room for conversations. If you're not sure of symbols that may inspire hate, if you're not sure about somebody else's story, like I said earlier, make space for them to tell their story honestly. You know, create the possibility of charting a more united path, a more diverse path forward. And I think that's the most important thing to do. I mean, once you form a connection with somebody, it's easier to empathize with them, but it's also easier to understand why it's worth fighting alongside them, you know. And it's not just anti-Semitism, you know, as I think we've said, you know, it's about anti-Black racism. It's about, you know, anti-Asian sentiment that happened, you know, in response to the coronavirus pandemic. You know, there's as a society, we face a lot of harbingers of hate, you know, who'd want us to turn back the clock of history. And our role, our responsibility is to have conversations and create room for, you know, create the possibility of building a better future. And I think it just starts with having conversations, intimate conversations with people about their stories and their experiences.
Thank you. Who else?
Margie, I'll jump in. Yeah, I just want to echo what the students have said, and first of all, I want to thank them for sharing. It's really meaningful and inspiring to hear you share both your experiences, and it's courageous. And so, thank you for doing this. And I just want to echo something that Matan just said, which is that, you know, it's usually anti-Semitism, which is what we're talking about, does not live by itself, right? That it is part of a form of multiple hatreds that usually converge together, and where there is anti-Semitism, there's also racism, there's also other forms of discrimination and prejudice. And if we're really committed to making this society work, to building a democracy that supports all viewpoints and celebrates diversity and celebrates the experiences of all sorts of people who come from different backgrounds, then we have an obligation to speak up when we hear all forms of discrimination being voiced. You know, a lot of you talked about how sometimes the easy thing to do in these situations when something uncomfortable is said is to not say anything. And I think the courageous thing is to speak up. And by speaking up and saying that, you know, that's not okay or that's offensive, it actually opens up a space for people who probably think the same thing that you do. But it's hard to be that first person to speak out. And I think that's one of the first things that can be done. You know, I'm often, you know, I do teach about the history of Nazism and the Holocaust, and I'm often reminded of that famous quote by Pastor Martin Niemöller, who, you know, talks about first they came for the trade unionists and the socialists and the communists and the Jews, and I didn't speak up until there was no one left to speak for me. And I think there is something very important and meaningful in that, that usually this sort of patterns and these cycles of hatred, they do begin to target other groups once they've gotten started. And so it's very important to speak out right in the beginning, especially if we want to create this type of campus environment that does support and celebrate all people from all different backgrounds.
And when someone speaks out, Kelly, who asked this question, when someone speaks out and it isn't you and it isn't another person from your group, it is one of the most amazing feelings in the world that someone who isn't in the group says, no, that's not okay. That cannot happen on this campus. And the opposite, I once was with a group of 100 middle school students, and my colleague happened to be there who isn't Jewish, and she talked about something about anti-Semitism, and they said, what do you mean you're not Jewish? Nobody who isn't Jewish would ever stand up about anti-Semitism. And so it cracked open this unbelievable discussion. And we asked them to raise their hand, and none of them believed that someone who wasn't Jewish would stand up for them ever. It was, and these were young kids. So when you take a stand about an issue that isn't your primary identity, it means everything to someone. Do any of the other panelists want to respond to Kelly's question? No. Okay, do we have other questions? If you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, that would be great, or get into the conversation. Have a pretty quiet audience so far. There's got to be someone here who has something to say on these topics.
So this is Dan Wiener from Global Affairs. I do have a question. I believe that when Jewish people get together and talk about anti-Semitism, we all have a common understanding that it's everywhere. And that's the first point. The second point, that it's been normalized. I think everybody in this screen here with the little boxes that's Jewish could tell stories about growing up in anti-Semitic incidents. And what I find is my non-Jewish friends are shocked. And so my question is, how do we help people? And there's probably some people on this call here that are not Jewish that are kind of surprised to hear some of these stories, because it is everywhere. My question is, how do we help people who are not Jewish understand how deep and how wide and how pervasive and how normalized anti-Semitic behavior is?
That is an excellent question. So panelists, Avi, Adina, I want to start there, and then I'll open up if anyone else in the audience wants to respond to it. But any of the panelists?
I'll jump in real quick. When the incident happened to me in 2017, one of the first things that my dad said to me, actually, and I think this was more of a generational thing between him, was exactly that. When he was younger, he experienced anti-Semitic comments all the time. And he was always told just not to say anything, not to speak up, because it wouldn't be to his benefit. And I told him, on the other hand, that I wanted to speak up, because I think that's the only way that we're going to make a change and make a difference, is by reacting in that way. And so I think that that is a change nowadays, that students should speak up and say something, so that we begin to normalize that it shouldn't be normal. Because when we don't speak up and we let it slide under, that's when we do give the sign that this is a normalized act and people don't want to speak about it. But when we do purposely want to speak about it, I think it opens a space. And I personally prefer, I have a saying that I don't like to use safe space. I use the term be comfortable to be uncomfortable. And I think that's when we create this environment where people are allowed to say, wait a second, I don't know about this, I want to learn more, or someone can say this isn't right and we need to do something about it.
So we need brave spaces. We need brave spaces where we're going to hear the stories and we're going to listen very carefully for stories from every group. And then we're going to feel comfortable telling our stories. Students were brave tonight. Not everyone is willing to share their story about a time, particularly a time that they were the target of prejudice. And then we need to share the stories even further, so that if every person who's here tonight, and I think there were 58 or something at one point, if everyone goes home, goes somewhere and tells a story about something they learned tonight, that's how change takes place. What else, students? Anyone else on the panel want to respond to Dan's point?
I'll just jump in with one thought on that, Margie, and I am curious to hear what other people think about this, but it connects back to something that all the students talked about in their experiences of coming to campus and coming from different environments. And I think sometimes it's especially challenging when you leave kind of a safe bubble, if it's a safe Jewish bubble, perhaps, where you haven't experienced this, and then you begin to encounter it in the quote unquote real world or outside of your safe bubble. And, Nathan talked about it, about the experience of wearing a kippah, right? And sort of wearing identifiable markers of one's Jewishness. And I think one of the challenges for American Jews in particular is that there is a sense that if you sort of remove the external markers of your Jewishness, that you can quote unquote pass, right? And you can make it without being identified as Jewish. And obviously this is something that is a different experience for Jews or Jews of color, right? Who kind of can say, well, that's not a strategy that's going to work, right? But I think, to Dan's question, I think that sometimes that has been the response, right? To either stay quiet about it, to not speak out, to try to pass. And it doesn't work over the long term, right? Because one of the things that's become clear to us is we have this belief that, in American progress, that things are going to get better. And one of the things that's become clear, especially over the last 4 years, is that we aren't always moving forward. Sometimes we move backwards, and those deep harmful influences that have been deeply embedded in our history and in world history are always there, and they always resurface. And so, while I do believe in the possibility of progress, I think we also have to be aware of the fact that this is a constant struggle that we have to engage with, and that it is important to find allies who are willing to engage in the struggle with us to confront these forms of hatred and discrimination. As Samaya was talking about, it's important to have people who are willing to join with us and speak out together. And we do have to find those allies to confront this. I'll just end with one thought, which is I think we all had a naive belief at some point that in the digital age, everyone would have access to information and we would, move towards this more progressive, enlightened world. And what's become clear is that the internet is a great place to spread hatred and, to spread conspiracy theories and to silo people into different groups. So it means that the struggle continues, and we have to continue to work with our allies to confront this.
I think Professor Pat. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Matan.
I'll go ahead. I think what Professor Pat said, brings up a larger issue. And in our national identity journal as Americans, we have this profound historical amnesia where after 30 years, we pretend that the past never existed. And so, when the riots or when protests happened, in response to George Floyd's death, everyone said, well, racism hasn't existed for 30 years. Civil rights happened. I don't know what you're talking about. And the same thing happens with anti-Semitism. People say, well, the Holocaust happened 80 years ago. Why are you guys still talking about it? And the reason is because these hatreds and these prejudices are deeply built and caked into our system. The March of Tears that led many Native Americans to their deaths, happened many hundreds of years ago, but they still have impacts on communities. And so it's up to us to be students of history, students of other people's stories. And so, and not forgetting that, and realizing that anti-Semitism is serious, it's also recognizing that a lot of the history of where we come from still shapes very much what happens today. And so recognizing that history is, I think, a very, very important first step, and acknowledging that we aren't anywhere near where we want to get as a society, but that path is still there for us to travel down. And so I think that's the most important story.
I'm going to make a quick comment and turn it to Adina, but a lot of people say to me when they're being really honest and they know they can ask me anything, they're like, I don't really understand what the big deal is about a little swastika. I don't hear it directly like that, but I know it's underneath. And so I think what Matan just said is understanding the historical trauma of a group is essential. And understanding the historical trauma of Jews when they see that symbol of the swastika is essential. So when we ask, what can allies do? Learn about that. What can Jews do? Learn more about our own historical trauma. Matan, said it beautifully. We have to know our history, and we have to trust when we have a reaction to something that it's not okay, instead of swallowing it and saying, I'm not going to make a big deal out of it. So I've been on a journey about that for many years in terms of understanding historical trauma. And I invite others to join me on that journey of, again, their own identity and others. Gina?
Thanks, Margie. And thank you, everybody who shared your stories. This is just incredibly moving, and I appreciate your honesty this evening. And as I'm sitting here thinking and reflecting on my own journey, and when I think about the things I've experienced and the ones that still give me a pit in my stomach are the experiences where I said and did nothing. I still, years and years, they're so salient still for me, and I still feel really guilty that I did not act. And when I think about why I didn't act, I think it was because I was afraid of saying the wrong thing, or making a big deal out of something. And I think by my inactions, I created, a sense of normalcy around the language and the behavior that I was experiencing. And it's the reason why I got involved in ADL about 15 years ago. So that, as Margie just said, this was part of my journey as a Jew in terms of better understanding historical and contemporary anti-Semitism and the impact and role that I played and the responsibility I had in speaking out against it. And I really hope that tonight is a call to action for all of us in terms of continuing to educate ourselves. Avi, I hope maybe you can share that slideshow so that we can all look at it later. And that our promise to the UConn community, I know I've had conversations with many staff and faculty on this call, is that we continue these conversations and continue educating ourselves and doing the hard work of being vulnerable, asking the right questions, and seeking to understand each other and then to be understood as we move forward in this work. And I'm really looking forward to all of us continuing this, that this is not just something we're doing tonight, but that we're all working on together to create, a more, as the president wrote in the comment there, an environment that we all value and want to be a part of. So thank you.
So I'm going to do two things at once. I'm going to ask to see if someone else wants to pose one more question or make a comment. And at the same time, it would be helpful for those of you who are here to put in the chat something that you're going to take from this, something you learned or something that an action you're going to take to because it will inspire someone else. If you take the time right now to write something in the chat, someone's going to read that and say, wow, I can do that, or I never thought of that. So please, I'm the type that sits there and doesn't put stuff in the chat too, but we really want to hear from you. So it would be really, really helpful if several people can write something in the chat. And at the same time, I saw a hand. Was it Jeffrey? Jeffrey, want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Margie. First of all, let me just say how moved I am and how impressed I am by the students who've spoken this evening. It's been very powerful for me to hear this and to listen to your stories. And I really appreciate what you said and admire you for your courage. And I'm really proud to be a part of this institution that has students who are so eloquent and so sincere in their and thoughtful about these very tricky issues. I just wanted to pick up on an idea that I think was in the background of Avi's comments and also Dan's, that I think is another thing that we need to be attentive to when it comes to things like anti-Semitism, and it's true also of anti-Black racism and other forms of prejudice, and that is the kind of pernicious assumption that there is a single notion of Jewishness or a single Jewish identity or a single way of being Jewish, a single way of inhabiting a Jewish identity, of Jewish practice, of Jewish belief, of Jewish political positions. One of the ways historically that anti-Semitism has functioned is to construct a certain kind of singular category of Judaism and Jewishness that doesn't acknowledge these differences, that doesn't acknowledge the range of different kinds of Jewishness that are out there. Avi mentioned Jews of color, which is an area of research that I know my colleague Lewis Gordon, who's on the call, has been very active in developing. But it goes well beyond that, and I think a place where we see unexpected forms of anti-Semitism is in that construction of a singular Jewishness, much the same as we would see, say, a singular form of Blackness or a singular form of Asian American identity. There are differences within differences, and that's just as critical to acknowledge, I think.
Yes, Professor Gordon.
Shalom, everybody, and thank you so much, all of you, for your presentations. I wanted to bring up both a comment and a question. I'll do it in reverse order. The question part is more, that connects from Sumia to the rest of you, is your experiences not only with being the specific object of anti-Semitism, but the other side, which is very peculiar in university environments because of the culture of civility. There is at times a form of hostility to the messenger. In other words, if you have experienced in bringing up the issue, it's shifting away actually from anti-Semitism itself to trying to construct you as the cause of the problem by bringing up anti-Semitism. And I'm just curious if you've had that experience. And the second part is it's rather striking because I was speaking very recently about issues of hatred. And I could mention from the perspective of a professor, I've never been at an institution ever in which there wasn't a student who in some way responded in a hostile way to me being Jewish, ever. In fact, even this semester. And the other part is, you already know there are ways in which people respond to me being Black. But as some of you already know who I am, you know that I'm also Tamil. And in each place one goes, the people who hate you can spot it's often the element of you, you know what I'm saying, that they dislike. And so the thing I was mentioning, I was just bringing up, is that that point about a continued struggle, and is a very real one. And one of the things that's important, of course, is you cannot galvanize a community to respond if you don't say anything. This is one of the reasons why, like, for instance, Nathan's story, I have a variety of kippot. So, you know, one day we could show off each other's. I have South African ones, Ugandan ones, you name it. But the basic, there's so many elements here that one of the things I'd like to just say outside of that question I framed is just a heartfelt thanks for you to inaugurate this. It's wonderful, as Adina said, that we see this as a beginning. And I'd like for the rest of you to know you're not alone. And there are resources here, not only institutional ones, but there are those of us who go through these experiences in a way that we can also offer some sort of both empathetic or vicarious insight, but also many of us have been actively involved in very concrete, long-term struggles against bigotry. So that's the remark part. But the question part, and the reason I raised this, of course, is you could imagine I'm also head of a department, and I've also run institutions where there are people who think the problem is in bringing up the problem. You see what I'm saying? And so I'm curious.
So your question is if anyone has an experience where they brought up, they said, you know, ouch, this is anti-Semitic, this is painful, and they were chastised for it, or there was backlash. So
Correct.
does somebody on the panel or otherwise want to respond to this question?
I can respond a little bit because in my story that I spoke about earlier, where I called out someone for saying Hail Hitler as a joke, I ended up speaking with him privately, and he let me know this horrible space that he was in his family life, personally, that he was going through, and that he uses dark humor to cope with those things. And for a while, that made me feel very guilty for bringing that up, for blaming him, for calling him out for something when he was going through a lot. So I think in that way, he was placing the blame on me for feeling offended by his words, instead of looking at himself and seeing that it doesn't matter what's going on in his life, those words are never appropriate.
Thank you.
Sorry, I just wanted to say one quick thing on this. I can't speak as someone who's Jewish, but I can speak as someone who's Indian. That's a big part of my identity. And I think I've tried to have a lot of conversations ever since BLM has become bigger and trying to fight hate has become a bigger part of my life. I've tried to have conversations with my friends who are not Indian and who are white about just like things that I've gone through in my childhood. And I've definitely noticed that for me, the hardest part to deal with is ignorance. And just, I can see why they're uncomfortable talking about it, because it's something that like was never taught to them, to have these difficult conversations. But what I've noticed is that having these conversations more and more and trying to reintroduce it is what's helped them understand what I've gone through as a child, or what I've gone through even like being Indian. And just doing it over and over again is something that's made me realize how to like combat any ignorance that I do see.
So I'm hearing don't give up, even in the face.
Yeah, I know I said earlier that it's not on the victim of hate to have to fight for yourself. I don't think that should be a burden that falls on victims of hate, but I also think that combating ignorance is really difficult, and I personally like to have these conversations and bring them up to combat ignorance.
I'm sorry, Samir, could I ask what part of India or type of
Yeah,
India?
yeah. I'm from South India, Andhra Pradesh.
Oh, my family's from Pondicherry.
Oh, cool. Awesome.
We might be cousins.
Probably.
So you never know when you're going to make a connection. So
Marty, if I can just say one thing to
Yep.
to respond to Lewis about his question about sort of the difficult part of being the messenger, the difficult part of being the person who speaks up. And it actually, I think it's a really important point, and it actually connects back to something that a number of you talked about, or that Matan also alluded to, sort of the tendency, or Dory also talked about jokes, right? Offensive jokes, that very often anti-Semitic remarks will take the form of jokes that can be quite aggressive, right? And many of you know I teach a class in Jewish humor, and that's one of the things that we end up talking about is sort of what's the difference between, you know, punching up versus punching down, right? What's the humor that is the humor of a minority group that's coping with persecution versus the humor of a majority group that's using an aggressive form of humor to belittle another group? And I think it's a really important, you know, in terms of sometimes when you talk about offensive jokes, offensive humor, and if you say, well, that's not okay, the response can often be, oh, lighten up, it's just a joke, right? And I think that's where it's really important to have that language to say, no, there's a difference between an aggressive, hateful type of humor that is not funny at all. It's a form of discrimination and persecution, as opposed to humor that we enjoy, that's a type of a coping strategy, or that, you know, makes light of a situation. It's very different. But I think very often, to Lewis's point, that will be the response that makes it especially difficult to respond to, you know, racist or anti-Semitic or xenophobic types of humor. Oh, just lighten up, it's just a joke. But it's not, right? It's offensive, and it can be hard to express that.
And also, people are listening. So again, I do a lot of work with kids, and I've been going to middle schools with Holocaust survivors for a long time. And I started asking the question, how many of you 8th graders have heard a Holocaust quote joke? First of all, I've said it twice in front of Holocaust survivors who were so shocked that kids were telling Holocaust jokes that I didn't even know how to respond. But secondly, every school I've been to, urban, suburban, you name it, almost 100% of the students raise their hand that they have heard Holocaust quote jokes. And we need to talk about that. Like, when you're with kids, to make sure they know, when you're with relatives, to say, this is not funny, this is not okay. If 100% of kids across Connecticut are telling me they're hearing these quote jokes and not, you know, and thinking that's okay, and often behind teachers' back, you know, not necessarily in front of their teachers, but so I want to reiterate, you know, that. I'm going to say a quick thing about not wanting to bring things up. I was at a lecture from a college professor, not from UConn, and it was not about anti-Semitism, but she started talking about Charlottesville, and she said the people marching in Charlottesville said, "You will not replace us." So I went up to her. I didn't want to say anything in front of the whole group, and I said, you know, actually they were saying Jews will not replace us. She said, no, they weren't. And I said, look, I work at ADL. We've studied this. We've analyzed the videos. She said, no, they were not saying that. And when someone tells you something is offensive or happened, the worst thing you can do is say that isn't true, that did not happen. It was shocking to me. And this was a professor. And I said, you know, well, why don't you go back and research it? Because I need you to know that's not okay. But, you know, so yes, when you call people out, even when you do it really respectfully, you never know what you're going to get back, but it can't stop us. Another thing I wanted to say to the whole UConn community, and, you know, I wasn't here for how all this happened, so I don't know how it was handled, but one of the biggest mistakes communities make, similarly, is when there's an incident, they don't name it. So this, I do a lot of work more with public schools about this, high schools. They don't want to say we had an anti-Semitic incident or a racist incident or an anti-LGBTQ incident. They just say something happened. And that, again, is like another slap when it's your group or you're an ally and you're waiting to hear, like, yes, this happened. Yes, we're going to address it. Yes, we're going to do something productive with it. But we have to acknowledge these things happen. And of course, you know, we don't want to as institutions. It's painful. We don't want to hear from the alums or the donors or anybody else, but we have to say these incidents happen and we can do something productive. And I want to really say how impressed I am with UConn and what you're doing and how we're listening to students, and that this is a beginning. I don't know if Nathan's still here. I know it's 2 o'clock in the morning in Jerusalem there, but what you said about the professors after your incident who stopped class and said, we are going to talk about this, that gave me goosebumps. To know that people said, we're going to learn from this, we're going to move forward from this, we're going to come together as a community from this. So I want to thank you all for the opportunity. I think this is a great beginning, and I hope there'll be lots of ideas moving forward about how to continue this work on anti-Semitism and all forms of prejudice and hate, and making UConn safe and a place that things are going to happen because they happen. So we're not going to have lumpy carpets by trying to put things under the carpet. We're going to say, you know, we're here, let's do something. A lot of voices saying, I'm here for you students. And guess what? This happens to adults too. So we're here for each other as a community. Tell me your story when it happens. Teach me so I can be a better ally. So it's 8:12, so I think it's a,
thank you, Margie. Before we just wrap up, I just want to thank, first of all, our incredible student and alum panelists for being here, for your incredibly inspiring, moving, and honest stories this evening. It's just been so heartening for me to listen to all of you. Thank you, Avi, for doing a wonderful job moderating and sharing your expertise with all of us. And a huge thank you to Margie from ADL. I've known Margie for many years, and she was very instrumental in initiating this program and spending time with our panelists and preparing them, and is truly an expert in anti-Semitism and fighting bigotry and hatred across the state and the nation, and is truly a mentor and an inspiration to me. So really grateful to you, Margie. She gave of her time freely for this, and very grateful for that. And thank you to all of you for being here. I know it's, you know, last week of the semester, you have a lot of things going on that I know are great demands on your time, but as many of you wrote in the comments here, this speaks volumes about the UConn community, and truly grateful for you making time to be here, to learn, to listen, and to hopefully take next steps forward with all of us. So thank you very much. Truly grateful.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I can't express how grateful I am for you all to you all for being here. And also that we will get the recording of this meeting up on the UConn Hillel YouTube if you wanted to rewatch it, if you missed any part of that. So that will also be a resource to you. And just thank you so much again for being willing to listen, because as you heard tonight, that really is one of the most important steps in combating anti-Semitism and all forms of hatred.
Night, everyone. Good luck on your finals, students.